Well, it's exactly 51 minutes past the hour of 7. My name is Siobhan, and the conversation in regard to environmental degradation in the Elgon region continues here on Sunrise at Sea. And this conversation comes at a time when the Elgon region is facing catastrophic climatic conditions in regard to the heavy downpour that left a number of people displaced and even others unaccounted for. Well, last month, according to Mr. Maximo Twinomuhanji, and he is the team leader of the Choga Water Management Zone at the Ministry of Water and Environment. He did highlight and say that environmental degradation in the Elgon regions poses an impending disaster. But also to add on his words was the Prime Minister, that is Madame Robina Nabanja, and she said that in the Elgon region, and she went and even assessed and told people, you need to leave the riverbanks because this is not where you are supposed to set up homesteads. But well, the current situation is actually very alarming, and we hope that the situation is put in control soon rather than later. And like I said earlier on the Twitter Jabs part 1, this is actually not the first time that the Elgon region is facing such calamities, because in 2019, a landslide occurred in Buwali sub-county, leaving 5 people dead and more than 400 displaced. While in October 2018, 42 people were reportedly killed and more than 500 people displaced in Sume village still, that is around Mbale district. Well, in August 2017, landslides also hit Sironko district, killing 7 people and displacing hundreds. Well, today joining me at the center of this conversation is none other than Mr. Kureba David. I hope I got the pronunciation of the name right. Good morning, sir, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Okay, well, Mr. Kureba David is actually a representative from the National Association of Professional Environmentalists, and what they do is basically it is an action organization that is committed to sustainable solutions to Uganda's most challenging environmental and economic growth problems. Now, they monitor government actions, conduct research, provide educational materials, develop science-based strategies, organize affected communities, and make common cause with other civil society organizations as well as international organizations, and engage government officials at all levels to make sure that environments are conserved and respected, and make sure that we do not actually have such things happening. So, sir, good morning. Good morning once again.
Good morning.
And thank you for joining us.
You're most welcome.
Okay, so for my first question, for starters, what are your sentiments in regard to the floods and landslides that hit the Elgon region?
Thank you so much, moderator, and thanks to CTV. I think when you look at what is happening in the region, it is a disaster. When you see cows swimming, when you see human beings flooding, swimming, when you see household items swimming, then this is actually the manifestation of climate change. You really see climate change in action. And it is very painful that we have lost lives, we have lost wildlife, and very many people are displaced, not knowing exactly what is going to happen. But of course it comes back to what the underlying causes are. It is anthropocentric, that human activities are the ones causing all this. In addition to, of course, we have very good policies and laws regarding protection of river banks, protection of wetlands, protection of forests, but they are never enforced. So when you see people doing all the activities on the river banks when they're supposed to be protected, what does one expect? If people are advised not to build in highlands and they continue to do the building in highlands, if all the trees have been cut, if areas where water is supposed to settle, percolate into the aquifers, get sieved, all those places are converted into commercial places, what is expected? If forests are converted into sugarcane plantations, that is exactly what happens. So when you look at the usefulness of trees, when rain comes, what we need to note is that we're experiencing serious droughts. So the soil itself is hardened. So when water comes massively, doesn't meet any tree, doesn't meet any grass, it just runs. And when it runs through its own path and finds the path has been compromised, this is what happens. So we must recognize that climate change is real, and the earth is retaliating. It is paying back. We have been fighting it, mistreating it, but it is coming back to also to fight for itself, because the people that are meant to fight for it are not doing a good job. Right.
Okay, so to what extent is environmental degradation to blame for this calamity?
When you look at Elgon, for example, that region, most forests have been decimated. If you go to the wetlands have been decimated. If you look at the river banks, this is where communities and other people are doing agriculture activities. While the government is meant to protect these river banks and protect these forests, they continuously get decimated. Forest loss in this country is close to 1-2% per annum. So what does one expect? You see what is happening, for example, apart from if you left Elgon alone, you see what is happening in other regions, like for example in Bunyoro. You see Bugoma Forest, it is the same thing, and that's how it started. Eventually what is happening here, we shift some other place. You go to you look at what is happening in Karangara, the forests are down and there's only oil palm. So if rains came, what would happen? So in very many areas, largely this is blamed on government, because they are not doing enough to ensure that these forests are protected, these wetlands are protected, people are guided to use, to follow the land use kind of arrangement.
Okay, allow me to represent a certain section of people that feel this way. I mean, very many times we are quick to say, as people living in communities, we shouldn't be encroaching on wetlands, we shouldn't be cutting down forests. But if you're not giving me an alternative, if my main source of livelihood is, for example, burning bricks, if that is my main source of livelihood, or if my main source of livelihood is actually got from that forest or from that tree that you're telling me not to encroach on, and then you're not giving me a viable alternative to use, what kind of situation or predicament are you putting me in? Because of some of the people in communities argue and say that, okay, environmentalists do not want us to, degrade the environment, but what other alternative are they giving us to use to survive?
Thank you very much. And this one is pretty clear. You cutting trees that naturally grew, you found them in the environment. What happens if all of them get defaced? I think the most important thing, and actually communities are also told this, they have to replenish these trees. They have to plant trees. They can do boundary planting, they can do woodlots, they can plant fast-growing trees to ensure that now these ones now protect the other natural trees from being decimated. Because if one continues to cut trees that one of them did not plant, what happens exactly? Eventually they'll get finished, and what will happen? Does that mean that they will die? So the alternative is, yes, much as you a charcoal dealer, if you're dealing in charcoal, for example, plant trees. Plant trees. If you look at green resources, it started a program. They are working on sustainable charcoal production. You can grow eucalyptus, for example, which is a little bit fast growing. We know eucalyptus and pine are also not very good species in some environment, but then they also do help the other natural species, because certainly people need firewood, people need energy, and whether they plant or they don't, eventually the natural trees will certainly go. So if we get some portion of land or some portion of forest and establish woodlots, so that now they compensate for encroachment on the natural trees, I think the remedy would be let them now plant trees. So if you have cut 20 trees today, you plant some other trees somewhere, so that when the other time for cutting comes, then you have an alternative. And secondly, you have to compensate. When you burn these trees, you are releasing carbon dioxide into the environment. So you must have some element of compensation, so that now the carbon dioxide that you release should be absorbed somewhere where you planted some of these trees. So I think that would be the ideal.
Okay. So as an officer of forests and biodiversity, from your perspective, why and how do you think people end up settling at riverbanks and forests, as we know that they are a national treasure?
You see, communities have their indigenous knowledge. When a river flows, it keeps depositing. What it deposits, those are like manure, and those areas are very fertile.
Oh, yes, yes.
And unlike the riverbanks, in other areas you will experience drought. But in the riverbanks, near the riverbanks, the areas are always very wet. They experience wet precipitation,
Okay.
but also the local climate, the microclimate. I think in Uganda they call it omusulo. In those areas you experience omusulo, but in other areas where the trees have been decimated, you will not experience that.
Yes.
And when you look at agriculture, that's what they need. They need 80% of the sunshine and 20% of the rain. The rest is just microclimate that deals with it. So communities are aware that that's where the fertility is. When they grow their crops near the river banks, certainly that's a done deal. They will get a very good yield. And in the event that rains don't come in time, they can easily irrigate. They would not need any transport and they would not take very long distances. They would just move, get water from the river and irrigate. But the most important thing is the fertility, but also the proximity to a very good microclimate that enhances growth of these trees. And of course, governments found some of these people already using it that way. Instead of pushing them a little further, they don't do that. But also I think somehow, I don't know how that one would do, but if, for example, there are programs on irrigation, on good extension services, then they would be advised on how to deal with that kind of agriculture. But because they still continue to do agriculture rudimentary, that's why they end up encroaching on areas where the soil look to be fertile.
But the people in these communities that have gone ahead to build, leave alone those that actually are growing crops, there are those that have decidedly and intentionally. I mean, look here in Kampala, so many buildings are being set up in water catchment areas. People are building in swamps. People are building along riverbacks. So my question would be: is someone sleeping on their job because you do not put up a structure unless you actually have a go ahead?
Thank you very much. And this is where that's what I actually mentioned in the very first place, that we have very good laws and policies to guide the environmental protection and use. But then the challenge comes in when it comes to implementation.
Yes.
If this is a wetland, it is meant to sieve water that runs from all these uplands and eventually get into the basin. But you allow, and this is largely done by big people, big shots. Because a poor person can never easily destroy a wetland, I'm assuring you. Because to infill a wetland, you must use a lot of money. They bring tractors lorries of soil for infilling. They bring lorries of marram, of rock, to ensure that they raise the level. So it is done by the rich people. But then, the people meant to protect the environment, the people meant to enforce that structures built should be on plan. The land use plan implementation is the work of the government, the people that we pay with our taxpayers' money. But they don't do it. And of course, I think some people even compromise. They fear. Some people are intimidated. You are an environmental officer, and the person who brought you is the person who is destroying the wetland. What do you do? You know, somehow, somewhere, in some of the way we get some of these jobs, the way I've seen, it is not the technical know-how. Sometimes the technical know-who. I've brought you, I've given you the job. You're in charge of protecting the Bunyoro region.
I expect you to be on my side.
If I come wanting some particular fragile ecosystem, you'll not hesitate. If you hesitate, the next day, you'll be transferred or you'll be sacked.
Then that kind of procedure and process should come to a standstill immediately, because we are degrading our environment, and what we are seeing right now is as a result of us being very negligent about our environment and not respecting it.
The challenges relating to environment may not necessarily be anthropocentric per se, but it is largely governance issue. The government is not following even if I owned my own forest, I should decimate that forest following the government, following the laws. I should have the felling permit, I should have ensuring that if I'm going to clear, I should go through the environment officer, but all those are not enforced.
Okay.
If it is, for example, a wetland, there is no way we earn decentralization. We have very many people that we pay taxes, we pay salaries to do some of this job. How can a very big structure get into a wetland, a 3-4 storied building, in the middle, in the passage in the wetland, when the other person is in office seated? What is this person meant to do? So I think enforcement is the biggest problem.
Okay. Well, some of the images and videos that you have been seeing on your screen are actually some of the events that transpired in the Elgon region. As you can see right there, lots of water and, you know, different materials, merchandise, people's livestock, you know, lives have also been lost while other people have actually been left unaccounted for. So back to you, sir. Now, some of the people are actually blaming the government for acting slow in rescuing the victims in such calamities. As an environmentalist, what measures are usually put in place to mitigate such incidents?
I think Uganda doesn't have the capacity, the disaster preparedness. They are never prepared. That's the thing. How can you be prepared when you don't have anything to respond to some of these things? You are talking about, if it were for the issue of preparedness, what would that mean? Because this is a natural calamity. A natural calamity, it would require you to have boats. It would require you to have helicopters. It would require you to have floaters. Does Uganda have that capacity? Does Uganda have a capacity to do that? They certainly can't do that. As in responding, because how long does it take a person to die in a flowing river? Because we are told it rained for close to 10, it started and rained through the night. So how could Uganda do that? It is something, but what could have been done was the mitigation. The mitigation is anticipation of what is likely to happen before something happens, so that you mitigate it. And the best thing should have been well conservation of the environment, ensuring that people don't settle in places in passages of water, ensuring that now communities are encouraged to plant woodlots, encouraging to ensure that people now a little bit build in a little bit raised areas, so that now, even if it rained and you found these trees, probably people would have gotten where to hold. You find people are moving from one area to the other, but you can't meet a tree, you can't meet anything on the way. Probably something would have gotten stuck. Some vehicles, you see, like cows, and you can eventually, if you
hold on to it,
hold on to something. Mm-hmm. How did you see any? All the trees have been decimated. So if the floods come, then it becomes like a lake, and when it is running, and when you have nowhere to hold, probably in those areas there is need to do some planting. Some things could have gotten stuck in some of those trees if they are there, but they are not there. So the mitigation would work perfectly well, rather than saying they go to rescue. Rescue from where? Rescue is not an easy thing. How do you rescue floods that have bombarded a sub-county? You have to start for 3, 4, 5. You save 500 people to 300 people. It is impossible. The only mitigation that can be done is ensuring that the environment is well protected. It is protected jealously. That's the bottom line. But saying that let the disaster happen, then you raise helicopters, then you bring floaters, that would not certainly work. Unless we are saying we prepare, and in those flood-prone areas, people are given like, how do they call it?
Life jackets?
Life jackets. So but that one does not make any economic sense and does not protect the environment. The bottom line is that the environment is paying back. It's fighting for itself. We must make sure that we respect our mother nature. Otherwise, whatever we do, you know, by the way, we are not hurting nature, we are hurting ourselves. In
return, yes?
We are hurting ourselves because now nature can exist without us, but we cannot exist without nature.
Unfortunately.
That's the bottom line. We shall continue to put these structures in the wetlands, in the water passage, but water will always find its own level and will always find its path. You build its path, it will come and go through, whether it puts it down or whatever it does, but it has to pass, whether you want one once or not.
Okay, now while we're talking about even protecting and conserving Mother Nature, it's very important that we also look at the climatic conditions that have been happening recently in Uganda. I mean, we experienced a bit of dry season, I think the whole of last week, but recently we have realized that there are so many rains that are going on. Just yesterday it rained, today morning it was raining. So my question would be, how would you explain this?
The explanation is climate change. You cannot predict what happens today or tomorrow.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of carbon dioxide emissions that form a blanket in the environment, in the stratosphere. Now, what happens is that you can't exactly tell what happens, whether drought or it is going to shine. We had that argument in Karangara, for example. When they cut trees, people in Karangara experienced a lot of rain. And they're saying trees were cut, but as people thought would have, we experienced drought, a very long drought, but now we're experiencing heavy rains. That is the manifestation of climate change. Where you're expecting rains, you're seeing sunshine and very long droughts. Where you don't expect winds, you see. So that is the biggest challenge now, that climate change you cannot predict. And what is happening in the north, the highly industrialized countries, there is a lot of emissions that come here. And I think our rains come from Indian Ocean and the Congo Basin, and then the microclimate. So because of changing climate and changing winds and currents, because of climate change, this is what we experience.
Okay, so would you say that in the Elgon region, and this is something that is actually very important, would you say that it is right to say that most of the Elgon region areas are actually not safe for human settlements due to the landscape and the terrain?
Absolutely, unless the place is fully rejuvenated. You know, when you disturb nature, then nature tries to reorganize. When you look at the mountain, on those mountains, you would find very big trees, big rocks, anthills. But you dig deep. You have seen excavation when they are trying to put structures. You destabilize in the process of putting the foundation. You destabilize the entire setting. And in the process, because you have opened, when water comes, it keeps seeping into where that opening that you made. And it ends up making like mudslides. Yes. Because you have put an opening and water now keeps percolating, it forms mud, and eventually the thing gives way. It gives way. So in as long as you continue to excavate on the mountain, it's like you're creating entry points for the water to now weaken where some of these houses are seated. Okay. So some of those raised areas where trees have been decimated, if you have seen how the way a tree is made, it can have a tree that will run from here up to the main road. Meaning that the soil from here up to the main road is intact. Then this root goes this side, then the other one goes. So if you have seen how solid buildings are built, the way they put bars and tie them together is how the roots tie together the soil and allow the percolation of water into the entire ecosystem. But because you cut a tree and you have killed all the roots that were connecting and putting these roots together, then that is the beginning of creating mudslides. And remember, as time goes on, these roots that were running from here up the main road will eventually decay and they become passage for the water. As water continues to go through those roots now, it becomes muddy there, and eventually the thing gives way. Because of putting very little water through the roots, now it turns out to be holes. Because these are very big roots. And when it decays, what happens? It turns out to be a hole. True. And now it becomes a weak point for the water to percolate and go in bigger quantities than it would be entering. So that becomes a very big challenge that in the long run, you'd find some areas are weakened and they eventually have to slide off.
So would you side with government? Because among the initiatives that government is actually putting into place is that they want to resettle people who are living in the Elgon region.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. Because instead of people losing their lives, why wouldn't they be resettled? Only that now, when a person is used to mountainous areas, those mountainous areas are fertile. When these people are taken to other areas, if this person was taken to my area, for example, Kashari in Mbarara, the fertility is a little low. You need to always put manure, fertilizers to make sure that now the area continues to be productive. So people that will be resettled from that area also need to be oriented in one way or the other, and they must first of all accept that they are going to areas which are slightly different from where they were staying, so that they don't go with expectations that the places that are being taken to would still be as productive as Mount Elgon was before they left the area. So I think there is need for that orientation and for small support and agriculture extension. And it is also a bit challenging. Someone who is used to that kind of mountainous arrangement, that kind of life, they have their marewa, they have their traditional foods linked to that ecosystem. Then you bring this person to an area that has no forest, that has no lioness, there are no efforts, no stranglers. Very many, a forest is a very good, is a very nice food basket. If you have seen people that stay, I went to Mbare, I saw how people eat marewa. You would not get it if you came to, for example, if you came to Mbarara. Where would you get marewa? So the traditional attachment is also a big challenge, but which people have to outgrow. if they have to have life.
Especially for those that have lived in the Elgon region for all their lifetime. I mean, it's their way of life, it's their culture, it's tradition. Even while the place may be unsafe at this particular point in time, even while resettling may be the way to go, but you know, I am living my culture, I'm living my tradition, I am living a place that I called home. But do you think that the housing structures should be revised when it comes to the Elgon region? Maybe how we build our houses, knowing that very well this particular region is actually unsafe.
I think it is a very tricky thing. How would you do it? Because traditionally, how those houses would be built, they would not, because in the Elgon, they're also intending to build some permanent or close to permanent houses, which never used to be there. They are putting just round houses with, you'd just put trees,
yes.
poles,
yes,
and they would thatch it with grass. So it would not affect the environment. But the problem comes in when it comes to excavation, digging deep, creating space. One creates here, then the other here, and the population is increasing. There are people that have stayed here, like the Bennetts. The Bennetts had stayed there for quite a long time. But if you looked at their structures, they are not as serious as the structures that are being built these days. So I think the whole thing rotates around these people need to be resettled.
Okay, so as we wind up, do you think that creating well-built proper channels for rivers, especially in the Elgon region, would actually safeguard the locals, and can we afford it as a country at large?
Building water channels, I think that is not the best. In environmental conservation, you don't restrict water to a specific channel. Allow water to flood,
to flow freely.
Allow water to percolate. Because we need this water, there is a water table beneath. And it is helped out, it is served by the water that comes in the rain. So the aquifers must be fed by the water that, instead of channeling water, you say, let water run to Lake Victoria. No. If you look at the setting of a hill, there are trees, there is grass. So as rain comes, it falls in a tree, then water comes through the trunk, gets onto the soil, then there is that kind of percolation. And water goes into the soil, and you're getting rejuvenation. You don't just, it's like if you went to Kororo, these places, in 20-30 minutes you will see floods. Why? Because the water that comes from the roof, that comes from their compounds, just run off. Very small percentage of the water percolates into that particular environment.
But then what would happen to the drainage system in the Elgon region if we are saying that water should not be shown where to flow, instead it should be allowed to flow freely? What happens when it comes to the drainage system in the Elgon region? Let's take a look. For example, when you have a pit latrine in the area, you will definitely need some sort of drainage system.
Yeah, a pit latrine, nature is different from what human activities present on environment. Water should be allowed to move freely unless you come to an urban setting, and it is the reason why we have always had problems with environmental conservation. If water is flowing from Ntinda, going downstream to the other side of either Chileko or wherever, you don't have to say, pass here, go turn left, go right. Allow it to flow, allow it to nourish and replenish the trees around there, the grass, and also when it gets to a point where it can be stagnant, allow it to go through the soil and now refill the aquifers so that we maintain the water table beneath. We have always put boreholes. If we don't maintain the water table, by allowing some of these wetlands to have flooding water and eventually water percolates down, how would these, for example, boreholes exist? They would eventually get dry. You have seen boreholes drying. What is the cause? The water table goes down and leaves the point where it is supposed to get the water from. So we need to allow also the wetlands and these areas for the water to go down and get into the aquifers, because we need the water table raised.
Okay, so as NAPE, what interventions or what strategies have you put in place to help the situation at hand, especially helping the government?
The way we work with government, first of all, is, of course, we need to conserve nature. We need to plant trees. We need to conserve, and we have always talked with them, we have always worked with them to ensure that wetlands remain intact. We have always kind of advised the government and requested them that some of these wetlands are encroached upon, not because communities actually, some of them intentionally do that, but they don't even know the boundaries. There should be a clear boundary of where the wetland starts and ends. But also, you can have wetland monitors. In particular areas, we have environmental committees under the local government system. But those environmental committees, what do? They should be enforced to do their job. They should be given clear terms of reference to ensure that now if it comes to water user committees, to environmental committees, let them work. Because environment is life. Without environment, there is no life. Then, when it comes to issues of emissions, we have already said these very old cars can as well stop, because we are running out of carbon dioxide. If you look at carbon, I think we have very little carbon that is remaining. And the entire world, in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they are looking at stopping the mining of fossil fuels, because they are a disaster. They are the ones we can never meet the target of bringing our temperatures below 1.5 degrees centigrade. So what would that mean then? Is that we stop, for example, if you look at oil and gas exploration and mining, that is a disaster. Look at the road that is going to run from Uganda up to Tanzania on a finite resource that is going to get finished in a short while. What will happen to that infrastructure? You have put the roads, you have put the pipeline, you have put the heating structures, you have put, and it is destroying ecosystems. And in the process, you're having emissions, and emissions against which you don't have forests, and the forests that are existing, some of them are being decimated, because if you have an airport, you have a refinery, you have all that, and you are destroying a forest, a natural forest. I thought that would be a sequester for the emissions that would come from such kind of setting. But if you see, the government goes ahead to allow the destruction of such a forest when you have an international airport, when you have pipelines, when you have roads, when you have all this happening in the area, then that is where the challenge now comes in.
So now that you have mentioned the government, as an environmentalist, what words of advice would you like to give them in regard to mitigating the situation, and what should they be doing?
Exactly that. What the government should be doing, one, fragile ecosystems should remain intact. If there are wetlands, let them remain intact. Let the laws work. For example, forest reserves, let them be rejuvenated. Let natural trees be put. Let them not be commercial. What is happening is that things have been commercialized. Some of these forest reserves that have been destroyed could be left to rejuvenate, but they have turned out to be commercial, and some of them have been grabbed. Of course, you know, there is in theory a clear boundary of where the forest reserve starts and ends. I've seen this thing happening in Usoga. There is a very big problem. The Bugoma issue, we have never known where the forest starts and ends. So there should be clear demarcation of some of these fragile ecosystems that we need to protect. If we are talking about a wetland, where does it start and end? Can we have communities protecting those particular ecosystems? If it is a natural forest, what is its function? Can we protect it and ensure that it is not destroyed? Can we, environmental patriotism should also be brought on board.
Be your brother's keeper as well.
Yes. That's the bottom line. We need to protect the environment. We need to plant trees and ensure that now, I'm thinking that part of we have had very many university graduates happening. Part of what they should be doing is you identify an area. If you are to graduate, you plant 5 trees somewhere. It doesn't matter. You don't need to have land. I'll come to you as my friend. I say, part of my work to qualify, I need to plant 5 trees.
5 trees.
And you plant those 5 trees. If you look at the number of graduates that you have per year, times 5 trees, in every year, you will find we will bring back the environment. It doesn't matter what happens later when trees grow and they are planted, but we need trees. We need trees for firewood, we need trees to sequester carbon dioxide, but we also need trees to hold soil together.
Okay, so finally to the locals, and let's not just tie it down to what is happening in the Elgon region, but locals in different communities overall, still in regard to environmental conservation, any words that you would like to let them know? Yes.
One, run away from small polythene bags. People go to supermarkets, they want everything, including the smallest thing. Give me a polythene bag. Stop buying some of those commodities using, because as you bring them, you are destroying environment. Secondly, do boundary planting around your small plot. You could be having a small plot, but plant trees around that very small plot. They could be fruit trees, they could be whichever trees that you feel you can plant, but as long as it is a tree that has chlorophyll, plant it and establish some small woodlots. But also some of those that are closer to wetlands, don't destroy them. They shouldn't be destroyed because it comes back to earth. When we destroy some of these fragile ecosystems that enhance our microclimate, we eventually are the ones to be affected. So we need to ensure that we keep our climate intact. So we plant trees, you run away from use of polythene bags, but also banning some of them because they become persistent organic pollutants. When you ban these, you have seen people putting polythene bags together, you ban them and they go back to the environment. They eventually come back because if you ban them, when they go, they can come back as wet precipitation or dry precipitation. And they have a persistent organic challenge on environment. So let's run away from using polythene bags. Let's try to plant trees, run away from destroying wetlands, but also run away from ensuring that from destroying forests. Because forests are the lungs of the world. Forests are the lungs of the world.
Okay.
Trees play that big role.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mr. David,
You're
for joining
welcome.
us this morning and giving us more insight in regard to conserving of the environment. And of course, we appreciate what your association is currently doing to make sure that we have a safer environment even for future generations. Well, that winds up the conversation that we had for you this morning on the Twitter chat. But before I do say goodbye, a word of advice that I would like to pose out there, and something that you always need to remember, is that at the end of the day, the environment actually does not need us. We need the environment because each and everything we eat, each and everything we use, we actually get from the environment. The environment gives to us. So if you constantly degrade and, misuse the environment negligently, then you will know that this is actually a recipe for disaster. Otherwise, that wraps up the conversation that we had for you this morning on the Twitter Jags. Do stay tuned because we still do have an amazing show lined up for you, and you'll be just right in time for our views, where we look around the conversation in regard to over communication. Keep watching Sunrise at Sea and don't blink. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. What's your name again?